Country Alliance. At HCA, Daniel works with private landowners, agency and nonprofit partners, and communities to enhance watershed health and increase private land conservation across the Central Texas Hill Country. Prior to joining HCA, Daniel led the, is it Dolores? Okay, Dolores River Restoration Partnership in southwestern Colorado and eastern Utah for 6 years. He has a Bachelor of Arts from Washington University in St. Louis and a master's in environmental management from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He's a 5th generation Texan based in Gillespie County. Daniel loves native plants. His discussion this evening is titled Hillside Stewardship, Reducing Erosion and Enhancing Plant Communities.
All right, well, Patrick, thank you so much. I appreciate you and Jerry and Lynn and everybody inviting me to join you this evening. Congratulations to the officers on your elections. Before I start, how many of you have perfect 100% cover of native plants across every square inch of your property? Every square inch. Oh my gosh, I actually see a thumbs up. That's remarkable. So perhaps some of us have a little bit of bare ground. Maybe we have a little bit of erosion here and there. All striving towards improvement. Well, I certainly have erosion at my place, and I'm always looking for ways to improve the health of my little piece of the hill country. And so that's really what we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to share my screen. Whoever started the session, I think you need to make me a co-host to actually share it. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So whoever has.
I just made you the powerful one.
All right, thanks. Let's try this again. All right. So let's see, there might be a moment of, there we go. So again, Patrick, thank you for the introduction. My name is Daniel Oppenheimer, and I'm the Land Program Manager at the Hill Country Alliance. And tonight, we're going to talk about Hillside Stewardship. The Hill Country Alliance, we are a regional nonprofit organization. We work throughout the Central Texas Hill Country to conserve the things that make this the beautiful place we all know and love. And our programs focus on issues related to land, water, night skies, and our communities. This evening, I'm going to, again, focus on Hillside Stewardship. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Hill Country. We all are lucky to call this place home. I'm going to give a little bit of context about this place, get into some of the nuts and bolts of Hillside Stewardship, share a few resources that I would encourage you to look into following this evening's presentation, and then we'll have a discussion. I do want this to be informal. We're a pretty manageable sized group this evening, and so I'm going to pose a few questions to you during my presentation. And then really at the end, I'd love to hear from you about some of the successes and some of the challenges you've had on your own places with regard to stewardship in the uplands and along your hillsides. Sound okay?
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, Hillside Stewardship is a very broad umbrella that encompasses many different aspects of stewardship and on-the-ground management. I've included somewhat of a laundry list of a caption underneath the photograph. I'm not going to get into any of these topics explicitly, but I just want to acknowledge their importance. And if we do during the discussion later want to get into any of these topics, we can certainly go there. This is your evening, and I want this to go where and how y'all want it to go. Okay, my hope, I have a couple of aspirations for this evening. I hope you actually learned a new item or two. I'm going to share some things that are probably very rudimentary, things you've heard and done, and you feel like you have a good handle on. I'm also going to share some things, some new terms and ideas that might raise some eyebrows. I might get some funny looks, and that's great. I hope some of this will be great refresher, and some of it will be new ideas that sort of challenge you and what you can do on your own place. With that knowledge, I hope that you leave tonight excited to go out and walk your place tomorrow morning, and perhaps look at things a little differently than you have before this evening. And while I want you to go outside and start thinking about hillside stewardship and perhaps new ways, especially how to slow and sink water that's coming down those hillsides, I don't want you to race out tomorrow to buy a bunch of equipment or start throwing around rocks and dirt. But my hope is that, again, you go out and just start to look at things a little differently and start to think about things in a different way. And with that knowledge and new way of thinking, start to consider some new projects, but don't just dive right in. All right, so let's get into this place that we call home, the Texas Hill Country. It's referred to as Flash Flood Alley. We know that because of our topography, our thin soils, and our weather patterns, that we can have some pretty remarkable and highly destructive floods. I suspect many of you live within the Blanco River Basin and remember the Memorial Day flood. Here in the slide is a picture of a flood on the Llano River more recently in 2018. And we know that when these things rip and roar, they can have tremendous impacts, horrific impacts to property, to human lives, and to infrastructure. We also know that when these areas are not flooding, more often than not, they are in drought or a pretty extensive dry period. This is that same river, the Llano River, in the drought of 2011. So we really do fluctuate from really intensive drought to flood. We also know that here in most of the hill country, beneath our feet, we have porous, fractured, fissured limestone beneath our feet. So what does that mean? That means that when a raindrop falls and it is absorbed into the soil, it can reach down into an aquifer, be below ground, and then reemerge to the surface through a spring, find its way into a creek and then a river. And then once in that creek or river, find yet another crack or fissure in the limestone and find its way back into an aquifer. So there's this remarkable and dynamic interaction between surface and groundwater. And really the intermediary between all of these processes of flood and drought and this process of interchange between our surface and groundwater resources is soil. And so we're going to spend a few minutes talking about soil. Perhaps some of you have soil, perhaps some of you don't. Perhaps some of you have this much or are starting to bristle and get a little envious at the amount of soil that is on this particular property in Gillespie County. But we know that soil, and really healthy soil, is important for so many reasons, whether it's healthy native plants, carbon sequestration, as well as our water, our hydrologic processes. So how do we take care of our soil? I have a colleague, Pete Van Dyke, who some of you may know. He's based in Blanco County, just upstream of y'all. And he has a saying that he loves to share during presentations, that bare ground is public enemy number one. And the reason bare ground is public enemy number one is because when we have ground soil that is open and exposed, we can see from the picture at top left that a single raindrop hitting that bare ground can start to dislodge soil particles. And that can be the beginning of a much larger process of disturbance and erosion on our hillsides. If you look at the next picture to the right, and you may have to move, I don't know about y'all, but on my screen, all the faces are blocking the image to the right. So you may have to move that image. But if you look at the photo on the right, I'm sure some of you have seen these demonstrations before. There's different simulations here. We have bare ground on the far left. We have different compositions of introduced and native grasses. And so on the far left, again, you've got the bare ground. On the far right, you have a healthy native grass pasture. And if you look below the chunks of soil and vegetation into those canisters, you can see that there's a tremendous amount of runoff and erosion happening with that bare ground. Whereas on the far right, you can see that there's very little erosion and a lot of catchment happening with the rain simulation hitting that far right treatment with a lot of good diversity and abundance of native plants. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir there, but it's nonetheless important to note that phenomenon. So again, there's the bare ground, and here's the diverse and abundant native grasses. So, when we think about native plants, it's really easy to focus on, well, what's happening above ground? Let's look at those grasses, those forbs, those sedges, those trees, and so forth. But we're starting to learn, just as we're learning with what's happening in our own bodies and our own guts in terms of bacteria and other microorganisms, we're learning that what's happening below ground is just as important as what's happening above ground. And so we're learning things like the fact that through photosynthesis, plants are providing sugars to microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. Those microorganisms in turn provide plants with water and nutrients and other resources. What we're also learning is that these organisms like bacteria and fungi help create the very physical structure of the soil. Bacteria, for instance, can create what we call micro aggregates, so small sort of chunks of soil, and fungi in turn can create larger aggregates. Think of like cottage cheese. And so together, these microorganisms are really starting to create the physical structure of our soil, as well as the porous space between those particles through which we can have oxygen and water. So I think you can ask the question, it's Monday night, we've got this soil food web with all sorts of tiny little critters going this way and that. You can pose the question, so what? That's a lot going on. I've never seen these things. I don't know what they look like. So what? Who cares? Well, when we have a healthy soil ecosystem below our feet, that does some pretty remarkable things. And this is a great slide from the US Department of Agriculture that demonstrates when we can improve the health of our soil, specifically when we can increase the organic matter in our soil by 1% across 1 acre, that can enhance the catchment ability of that soil by up to 25,000 gallons. So think back to the previous slides about flood, about drought, and about that interaction between soil and groundwater. If we can start to enhance the health of our soil so it's acting like a sponge and absorbing more and more water, that's going to mitigate floods, that's going to absorb and save water for those dry periods, and that's going to feed our springs and creeks and rivers over a longer period of time. I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions, especially for anyone who might be new to the group. Please don't be shy. This presentation is meant for everybody. And so if you do have questions, take yourself off mute, pose a question, enter it in the chat. Don't be shy. I want to make sure, especially since we're not in the same room, that that we're all on the same page, or at least the same chapter tonight.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say that 25,000 gallon number is just mind-boggling. That's amazing.
It is. And so to me, that's really encouraging and empowering, because to me, that says you don't have to own a 1,000-acre property to make a difference. Even in our backyards, if we can start to improve the health of soils just in a little piece. And just think about the 20 people on this call, if we all start to improve the health of our soils and then talk to our neighbors and our family, and everybody starts improving the health of our soils, it really scales up to make a tremendous difference across a watershed. So yeah, it's really exciting and encouraging.
Patrick, Daniel, does that hold regardless of the type of soil you have? A loam versus sandy loam versus whatever it might be?
It's definitely something that needs to be contextualized, Dell. It is a big, broad statement, and I think there's also some more context to it, where you're increasing the organic matter through several inches of the soil as opposed to just, you know, a teeny tiny bit on the surface. So there definitely is there are some nuances to this big, bold statement for sure. But nonetheless, it's still pretty remarkable to think about what we can do, especially when we're working together.
I had a soils guy one time tell me that there are as many microbes in a fistful of soil as there are population in the world.
It's, yes, I mean, you can have millions and billions of microorganisms, I mean, just, yeah, in a cup of soil. It's incredible. So there are a handful of principles that a number of folks have started to promote to enhance soil health. There are entire books, there are entire presentations on soil health guiding principles, and I'm just going to cruise through them in a minute or two. One of the things we want to do, we have this remarkable ecosystem below our feet, and so we want to reduce the physical and chemical disturbances, for example, tilling, that might really disrupt the biological and physical structures beneath our feet. Likewise, remember that previous slide of bare ground is public enemy number one. We want to keep the ground covered. Ideally, that's with native plants, but if we need to use leaf litter, mulch, logs, and other things to armor that ground, that's going to, again, prevent those raindrops from dislodging soil and starting that erosion process. We also want not just native plants, but we want a diversity and abundance of native plants. Why might we want a diversity of native plants in the context of soil and soil health? Any thoughts?
Well, not all conditions are going to be suitable to all plants. So the more diversity you have, the more likely you are to have at least some plants that are doing well.
Sure, absolutely. Conditions vary. And also, a root is not a root is not a root. If you have a diversity of plants, you're going to have some roots that are deep, some that are shallow, some that are robust, some that are narrow, and they're all going to weave together and provide additional structure to start to shape and hold that soil together. So again, that's why we want that biodiversity with regard to our native plants. And then maximizing presence of living roots. Why do we care about living roots?
Well, Daniel,
Yes.
isn't it true that as the roots die off, they add organic matter to the soil?
Yeah, absolutely. And then when those living roots, when we have healthy, vigorous plants, what are they doing?
Holding the soil in place.
They are absolutely holding the soil in place. They're also, through photosynthesis, again, they're providing those sugars, those carbohydrates into the ground, which are feeding these microorganisms. Those microorganisms are exchanging those carbon sugars for things like water and nutrients and other resources to the plant. So that interchange is incredibly important for this community of microorganisms below our feet. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to ideally integrate animals into this ecosystem. You know, the most common reference is to think back to replicating the bison, but that's really hard to do if you only own an acre, 5 acre, 10 acres. And so there's various things we can do, whether that's working with If you have a neighbor who's a rancher, you could arrange to have their livestock on your property for a short amount of time. Or if that is not feasible or preferred, you can add things like vermicast or other animal byproducts to your property, again, to feed that whole community of microorganisms below our feet. So again, I just cruised through those guiding principles. There are entire presentations and books just on this one slide. We're going to keep going. So for anyone who might have bristled at that photograph at the top left, where we've got about a soil profile that's showing about, we'll say 4.5 feet deep, perhaps you've got more caliche and less soil. And so we're going to transition into properties that perhaps look a little bit more like what you have in the center, where you've got some bare ground. Perhaps that's from current management practices, or maybe that's from something that happened 100 years ago. And so what do we do if we don't have those deep, rich soil profiles, but we want to grow native plants? That's really what this next section is about. And this is a photograph from, again, Pete Van Dyke. You can go to his website, Drought Proof Texas. This is a site that he worked on that looked like this before he started. And by slowing and sinking the water and how it moved down this hillside, this is the same site I'm going to show you. You can see that through several different techniques, he was able to slow and store and sink water so that it's able to support a remarkable diversity of native grasses and shrubs and trees. And so we're going to talk about a few of the methods that he and others have started to use in the hill country. Some of these, again, are going to be review. Others are going to be brand spanking new, and you're going to look at me with funny expressions, and I look forward to those funny expressions. Before we jump into the methods, which is the most fun part, it's worth noting or talking a bit about erosion and what that even looks like, or the different ways that it can happen. And so if you think back to an earlier slide where we had that raindrop on the left, that's what we refer to as splash erosion. That's when you've got a raindrop hitting bare exposed ground, and it's hitting with enough force to it can dislodge those soil particles. And so that's what we refer to as splash erosion. A second form of erosion is what we refer to as sheet erosion. This is when you've got a good rain event and perhaps the soil is really compacted. You're not getting the water infiltrating into the ground. And so rather than infiltrating, it's starting to move in a uniform or sheet fashion across the landscape. Once you start to have that sheet flow, what happens is, just like on your windshield when it's raining, those drops ultimately start to converge, especially when you get a drop in elevation. So once you have sheet erosion, as you can see at the top of the hill in this diagram, that water ultimately starts to converge with that drop in elevation, and you start to get what we refer to as rill erosion. In rill erosion, again, you're starting to have that sheet uniform flow converging and forming very small channels, literally 1 inch, 2 inches deep. And that comes from typically a nick point and a drop in the elevation. Those rills then in turn will converge. And once they converge, you'll then start to have the formation of gullies, which is a much more serious form of erosion. And typically when those channels become 4 and 5 inches deep and deeper, we start to refer to that as a gully. So now I'm going to pose a question to y'all. We've just talked about 4 different types of erosion. Why in the hill country might we have that erosion? What's going on across the hill country, perhaps on our property or our neighbor's property, such that this is even something worth talking about this evening? Why is it an issue? What are some of the sources of erosion that you're seeing?
Cultivation.
Cultivation? Okay, sure.
and maybe mismanaged cultivation.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. There are definitely. Oh,
Flash
go-
flooding.
Say that again?
Flash flooding,
Yes,
deluges.
sure. When we have those, absolutely, when we have those deluges of rain, even with good plant cover, when you get some of those 100-year flood events, they're absolutely going to set things back for sure.
We have neighbors who they have native grasses, but they cut them very short, mow them really short.
Yes, so excessive intensive mowing for sure can be a stressor on the land that can encourage erosion.
As well as overgrazing.
Overgrazing, correct. Grazing is just like everything else is a tool. It can be used to improve the health of our soil and our lands, or if done perhaps too intensively, too excessively, yes, it can lead to erosion as well. How about our roads? Has anyone here ever had to go buy some more material to patch up a road?
You bet.
Yeah, the way that we site and build and design our ranch roads can be a tremendous source of erosion on our landscapes. So yeah, there's a variety of sources of erosion. And
Particularly when we pave them over to keep them from eroding.
sure, when we make things, when we add impervious cover, whether that's on our roads, parking lots, homes, and yes, when we create additional impervious cover, absolutely, that water has no place to absorb and it's going to walk, run, or race down that hillside. Absolutely. So yes, there are a tremendous amount of sources of erosion that we have in the hill country. And the reason I bring these up is because in order to improve the health of our hillside so that we've got, good soil profiles and native plants, we need to really focus on the sources of erosion and manage them appropriately. If we're not looking at the sources and we're just focusing on the symptoms, and I'm going to hit this home several more times tonight, we're really doing the land a disservice and we're not going to be as effective as we could. So I'm going to talk about erosion from a different vantage. This is looking at a profile of the hillside. Same concepts. If you look to the left of the image, that's where that sheet flow was starting in the previous slide. And as the water, if it doesn't have a way to infiltrate into the ground, if it's not being slowed or stored, it's going to start to go down the hill. And when it finds that drop in elevation, what we sometimes refer to as a nick point, it can start to cut. I mean, water carries a tremendous amount of power and force, and it can start to cut into the hillside. And when it does that, when it finds that drop in elevation, as you can see in this middle scenario here, what it can do is the force of that water can start to cut into the hillside. And that's what we refer to as a head cut. And head cuts are alarming, or can be alarming, because if we don't manage them appropriately, that water is going to continue to carve. It's going to hit that nick point and continue to carve away that soil and actually migrate upslope. And if we don't manage it, it can also down cut and basically move and impact things up and down the hill from that nick point. So head cuts, we really need to understand why and how they're forming, and to take to step back and understand them holistically rather than just look down and say, oh, that's ugly, I need to throw a bunch of rocks or logs in that spot down there. So again, I told you I was going to emphasize this point numerous times because it's just such a common knee-jerk reaction. When we see a gully, I mean, how often have you seen someone threw a bunch of tires or rocks or logs down in a gully because they realize something's not right, but they don't quite understand what's happening across the hillside or across the watershed. And so there's the focus, this fixation on the symptom, that ugly gully, versus why it's forming and how to manage it. So again, my hope tonight is that we can all sort of step back and think holistically about things like soil health, where and how erosion starts to happen with that first raindrop into sheet flow and into the formation of things like gullies. And sometimes that takes walking the property a bunch of times, walking up the hill, walking down the hill, and especially doing so when it's raining, to really start to understand where and how water is absorbing or running down your hillside. So here's just, this is mostly in jest, but folks will throw tires or wood slats or anything they can find down in that gully. But if you're just throwing stuff down there, that's just addressing the symptom. You're not slowing down the water or stabilizing that head cut. So that head cut's just going to keep working its way up the hill. And now you've just got a bunch of ugly tires and wood crates and whatnot on your property.
Well, what do you do at that point? You try to introduce some grasses? I know you're going to answer this question.
I am so glad you asked that. That is exactly what we're going to get into right now. So, but if you don't feel like I answered it, call me out and let's talk about it. So first, I'm going to go through some simple strategies. Again, some of you may have been doing these for many years. And some of you, perhaps this is your first meeting with the Native Plant Society, and this might be new material for you. So I'm trying to meet everyone where you're at. We'll talk about a few simple strategies, and then we'll get into some advanced ones, Jerry, that really start to address what to do with that head cut. So first, some simpler, easier strategies. One thing that we can do is we can use rock material to slow and sink water. Now, why might we want to slow and sink water? I keep mentioning we need to slow and sink water into our hillsides. Why?
Returns to the aquifer.
Yes, we do want to recharge our aquifers. That's true. What else happens?
It also is providing holding moisture for the plants that are already there.
Yes. When we are slowing down that water, the plants that are localized right there certainly benefit from the moisture. The water is also, when it's being slowed down, is recharging the aquifer. That's true. What else happens when we slow water down that otherwise might be racing down the hill?
It allow it to infiltrate.
It can infiltrate.
The soil gathers
Soil
back.
particles. Yeah.
Yes.
Prevent erosion that otherwise would have happened.
Yes, that water, again, we saw with that raindrop, it has the ability to dislodge and carry those soil particles away and down the hill. And so if we can slow that water down and perhaps even stop it so that it can infiltrate, not only are we providing the moisture to the plants, not only are we going to recharge the aquifer, but that water is going to deposit those soil particles. And this picture is a great example. This is a property outside of Bandera, Texas, which was just bare caliche a few years ago. The landowner went out to her property, and in a single afternoon, she used a rock rake, and she built these little rows of rocks, or you can call them rock berms. She built them along contour lines, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment, following the natural topography of that hillside. She didn't even throw seed out, but just by slowing that water down, that allowed enough sediment, soil, to start to accumulate that she now has several species of native bunch grasses establishing, regenerating on their own, just because she slowed that water down using a rock rake in the rock that was just laying around her property. Any questions there?
Rock rake. Is it a machine?
Say that again.
What is a rock rake? Is it a machine?
Oh, no, just a heavy duty rake that is durable enough you can see there's a picture of my hat right there. So these aren't big rocks, just a sturdy enough rake that can mobilize that size rock.
We throw ash juniper clippings in there and the branches and that sort of stuff too to slow it down.
Jerry, you are my best friend. You're setting me up for every one of my slides tonight.
You're welcome.
I'm not going to get into brush management tonight, although in our discussion, if we want to go there, we certainly can. That's a huge topic. But through brush management, whether that's something we're doing on our property or perhaps your neighbor is, typically there is a lot of biomass that is produced through brush management. And so this is the same landowner. I feature her and her husband pretty heavily throughout this presentation. They did some selective brush management. They thinned out the ash juniper cedar. They didn't remove it all, but they thinned it out. And then they took the logs from that management effort and they created not one, but 3 different rows of logs. And again, they did that following the contours, the natural topography of that hillside. Here they did actually throw down some native grass seed, and then some of that biomass from the brush management, they also mulched. And so this was a combination where they created 3 different rows of logs along the hillside. They broadcast seeded some native grasses, and then they threw a very, very, very thin layer of mulch cedar on top of that seeding. And I'm not saying that this is perfect, but this was just bare ground. I mean, dry, old, beat up range site that is really recovering in a remarkable fashion. And so with both the rocks, the rows of rocks and the rows of logs, we find that if you just do one row, that might not be enough, but if you can start to build several of these structures, they're going to complement and reinforce each other. And that's another big theme is sort of creating greater resilience and structures that can reinforce one another. So Jerry, yes, great strategy. You know, we all probably have have a neighbor who has a pile ash juniper that they want to burn. Instead of burning it, use it as a tool or a resource. It's great for this type of restoration.
Yeah, Daniel, there's a place on the trail at Blue Hole where the trail gets close to 3237, where they did something like this a number of years ago, and it's amazing. I've been watching it every year, and it's getting more and more bunch grasses. And if somebody wants to walk that trail, they can see what they did.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. All right, so I'm going to go into my third and final one of the more simple examples. Oh, I think I've got a slide before that. So here, again, you can see that there's a bit of a nuance to how she's laid out these logs, similarly to the rocks. Again, she's following the contour lines. You don't have to follow the contour lines, but when you can start to follow the subtle shapes of the topography, you're going to really enhance the effectiveness of how you're slowing and storing water. So I talk about the contour lines. Surely everyone has seen a topographic map at some point in your life, and those topographic maps, in fact, showcase the contour lines. And so that's what I'm referring to. And so some of you might be remarkable golfers and you can read the green really well, and perhaps you don't need a map or some device. You can see the subtleties and start to define those contour lines on your hillside, and that's great if you have that skill. I certainly don't. You have a couple other options. You can use a device like here on the right, which is called a laser level, which uses a sensor to start to, again, key in on where those contour lines are flowing across the hillside. These devices are not inexpensive. And so if you have some projects that you're really excited about, you could talk with some neighbors and perhaps pool resources to buy a laser level to share. Or yet another option is you could talk to your local natural resources conservation service personnel most NRCS offices have a laser level. You could schedule a site visit with them, flag those contour lines, and again, use those to inform your design of rows of logs and or rows of, so logs and rocks. Our third and final simple strategy that I'm going to share tonight is to use that cedar slash. Again, so many people will remove ash juniper, make those piles, and just burn that material. But this is a phenomenal resource. It's already on your property, and there's so many things that we can do with it, whether that's creating those rows of logs that we talked about, using cedar slash similar to how a gardener might use mulch. You don't want to make it too thick. You only want to keep it to about a couple of inches thick. Otherwise, it will just take a long time for those grasses to germinate and work their way through that thick material. Another opportunity, which I don't really go into here, but you can also use cedar slash as caging to protect your native seedlings and saplings. And so use that material. It's a phenomenal resource. It's already on your property or probably your neighbor's property. So use it. Don't just burn it or have it hauled off. All right. So I told you I'd share a few of the simple, straightforward strategies. And then I told you I'd share a few more advanced ones that I think one or two will probably get a couple of funny expressions from y'all. So I look forward to those in just a moment. So let's go back to that head cut. Jerry, you said, all right, we got these head cuts. What the heck do we do with them? We know not to just throw a bunch of tires in the gully and walk away. Great, but what do we actually do so that that head cut is not migrating up the hill and taking bites out of the property going up, as well as down cutting and taking bites out going downhill? There's a couple of things that we can do. So I'm going to get into our first advanced strategy, and it is called a rock run down. That's right, a rock rundown. And a rock rundown is designed to address that nick point where you get the drop in elevation, water flowing over that nick point and starting to cut and bite away at your hillside. A rock rundown is designed to do one main thing, and that's to stabilize that head cut so that it's not continuing to bite away at your property. I apologize that this picture is a little fuzzy and out of focus, but I think it's clear enough to understand what a head cut looks like. You can see here, looking at these red arrows, that you've got this nick point or this drop in elevation really of several feet. And you've got a head cut forming. And that head cut, if you squint, you can see there's a wide swath of bare ground, as well as you'll see that there's a couple of rocks that have been placed there. And this is the first step towards these landowners building a rock rundown, again, to stabilize this head cut. So I'm going to give a couple of photographs, and then I'm going to go into a diagram that sort of goes through the step-by-step process. So here, zooming in, you can see those two rocks that have been placed in that exposed soil. We've got this this head cut forming. Again, you want to use whatever you have access to. If you have round rocks, use round rocks. But if you can find angular rocks, think about each of these rock structures like a puzzle. You want to create the best fitting, most snug puzzle that you can create, where all these rocks are fitting well together. You don't have a lot of gaps, so that it's really covering that bare ground and slowing and sinking that water. So here's the beginning of that rock run down structure being built on the left. On the right, you can see that they've really taken a lot of angular rocks, put a lot of thought into how they can fit well together. If you don't like puzzles, if you are more of an artist, you can think of this as an art project where you're really trying to form a sculpture, if you will, out of rocks that all fit together with one another, as well as fit well into the landscape at the top of the head cut and the bottom. So here's what that rock rundown looked like when it was completed. You can see, again, they put a lot of time into finding rocks that fit well with each other, as well as fitting pretty flush with the top of the head cut, so that, I mean, the reason it's called a rock rundown is so water is able to come down from the grass and it's going to run down that structure. As it's running down, it's going to find its way into those cracks. It's going to infiltrate. It's going to slow down. It's going to provide the moisture that we talked about earlier, but a lot of that energy is going to be reduced and managed through this structure. I'm going to now take us into a diagram that explains this a little bit more functionally. If we want to go back to the pictures, I know we all learn differently, and so here's sort of the photographic visual. Now let's get into the diagram. So here's that side profile, again, where we have that head cut. We've got the drop in elevation, that nick point, where the orange arrows are, where water is going to bite into that hillside. And if we don't manage that head cut, it's going to continue to work its way up the hill and down cut below. Notice we have one great native plant that is sitting right there. I'll let someone decide what native plant that is. I'm envisioning it's a little blue stem. That is little blue stem right there. We've got one little blue stem there. And that's important because if we've got native plants already in that disturbed site, those roots are doing us a huge service, providing some level of stabilization. And so as we build all these structures, to the extent possible, we try not to remove any deep-rooted plants that are already helping us slow water down and stabilize that site. So you'll see in a moment why I pointed out that plant. Again, I'm gonna have to move everyone's faces away to see the text at the bottom of the screen. This is the site after a rock rundown has been created. Oftentimes, if you have this really dramatic drop in elevation, you might need to create a gentler slope. The suggested rise to run is 3 to 1. With that gentler slope, you have a much larger surface area to work with, and it won't be as dramatic in terms of how water is racing down. To build this rock rundown structure, the first thing we're going to do after we create this gentler slope is we're going to take the big rock that we can find, or big set of rocks. We're going to build a small trench, and we're going to set those rocks in the soil so that they're only about 1 inch or 2 above the ground. Again, we want this to be a sculpture that sort of weaves and blends into the landform as much as possible. So the first thing we do is we build that small trench. We put our row of large footer rocks at the bottom, again, just sticking up about 1 inch or 2. And then we take our other rocks like a puzzle, and we're going to fit them together as snugly as possible so that we're covering that exposed ground. Notice that little blue stem, we left it there. We didn't take it out. Those roots are providing the stability that we're looking for. And so we place the rocks around that little blue stem, again, working our way up that gentle slope. And then similar to what we did at the bottom, we want to make sure that that top header rock is placed well and working well into the landform. And we want that rock to be flush with the soil so that, again, as the name suggests, water isn't hitting it and bouncing off of it, but rather it's running down it, similar to a staircase. And every time it's working its way down those different rows of rocks, those rocks are slowing it down, taking the energy, the force, the velocity away from it. What you couldn't see in the previous picture, but I talked about earlier about structures reinforcing and complementing one another, is the landowner, in addition to creating that rock rundown, created, I think, 4 or 5 different rows of logs, those cedar logs, above the rock rundown, so that water is being slowed down even before it gets to the head cut. So I hope you think about these not sort of as individual methods, but as sort of a suite of tools that can be used to reinforce one another. So again, that is the rock rundown structure. Its function is to stabilize head cuts, and it can be done using rocks that are well fit together and into the landform. Any questions about rock rundowns? All
Have
right.
they backfilled with some dirt to get that slope rather than that cliff? I mean, in your diagram, you have a much gentler slope and you've lost your nick, as you called it.
Yeah, so there's a number of things that you can, great question. There are a number of things that you can do with the dirt. Some people will essentially sprinkle it or deposit it on top of the rocks. You can broadcast seed. Some people broadcast seed before they put that rocks down. Some people throw it on top of the rock and then use that soil that they may have had to move. Yes, so you definitely want to use that soil. Each site is going to be different, but yes, you definitely want to make use of that soil. And that's assuming you've had to move some soil to create that gentler slope. As we saw in the photographed example, there was enough vegetation there that they did not actually have to move any soil. They were able to just key the rocks in. But yes, if you do need to move some soil around to create a more gentle slope, absolutely make use of that resource on site.
Daniel, I find it a little dismaying that even with the amazing cover of grass that you showed several slides back with the head cut they were putting, the original one where they were putting the rocks in right there.
Yes.
How did it form to start with? That looks like it's got lots of grass.
You are right. There are a couple of things happening on this particular property. Historically, it was I think overgrazed, but really the key stressor here is just outside the property line. There are a network of roads, public and private, that are dumping tremendous amounts of water, funneling huge amounts of water onto this property. And so they are doing the best that they can using these methods when they have just immense amounts of water from all these roads that just is being concentrated and raced right down their hillside. So this is I don't want to call it a rare situation. I think there's plenty of properties where things that are happening beyond the property line affect what's happening on yours. But yeah, this property is having to absorb tremendous amounts of water coming off public and private roads. Good question. Okay, so again, that's the first structure. It's a rock rundown. The intent is to stabilize a head cut. The next structure, which some of you may be familiar with, is to build a berm or a swale. Again, if we can start to design these things following the natural contour lines on the hillsides, that's going to increase their effectiveness and their ability to slow and sink water. Whereas a rock rundown is designed to stabilize a head cut, berms and swales are typically used to capture and store huge amounts of water. And so here are two examples. On the left, we have a property in the Blanco River Basin. And this landowner has created two berms and swales. When I say a swale, that's like they're removing a small amount of dirt so that they're creating a bit of a channel. And then they're taking the soil, and this goes back to the earlier question, what can you do with soil if you have to remove some? When you remove some soil to form that wide swale, you can then use it to create the berm on the downhill side of that swale. If you're just creating berms, whether that's with rock or log or soil, that's a pretty low risk procedure. But once you do start to remove soil, you really need to either have some good math skills to calculate the appropriate size of these features, or you want to bring in someone who has a pretty good grasp of how to build and design these swales. But again, here are two examples. On the left, I've circled some landowners so you get a sense of the size of those berms. What they did in this example was, after, again, digging out the swales, putting the dirt on the downhill side of the swale to create the berm, they did a broadcast seeding of native forbs and grasses, and then they put a very thin layer of mulch on top of that seeding. On the right is another example. This is the landowners back in Bandera. You can see that the swale, it's much wider than it is deep. And they actually created several of these berms and swales going down the hill. Someone asked me earlier about, why do they have to build these structures? That's the public road you can see on the left side of that picture. What you can't see is the private roads that are coming down the hill, feeding into that road and just funneling a tremendous amount of water onto their property. Again, if you're going to be moving dirt to form swales, you do need to put some real thought into it. There's a lot of considerations for where and how you site and how you design these. And so you don't want to just race out and start taking equipment around and moving soil. You really need to put some thought and consideration into where these are sited on the hillside and how they're designed. Again, I'm going to do a recap because some of these might be new strategies, and then I'm going to offer, I think, 2 more strategies for y'all. We talked about the rock rundown structure, which is designed to stabilize those head cuts. And then we just talked about berms and swales, where you are trying to capture and sink tremendous amounts of water. We've talked about the benefits of doing that. You're reducing erosion, you're adding moisture that benefits the plant community, you're recharging the aquifer. There's plenty of amazing things happening when we slow and sink and store that water. All right, I've got 2 more for y'all. The next is what we call a media luna. Who's ever heard of a media luna? I see some smiles and shaking of heads. I don't see any weird looks. So a media luna serves a different function. A media luna is designed, if we have some concentrated flow and we want to slow it down and then spread it out, this is our best friend right here. And so here at the media luna, that blue arrow shows about where the water is coming down the hillside. So when you build these structures, you want the bottom or the center of that half moon to sort of be in line with where that concentrated flow is coming down the hillside. And then the tips of that half moon, in theory, should be about the same height as far as meeting that same contour line that's going across the hillside. Media lunas should be designed so that they are big enough to capture the typical amount of water that you would expect in terms of a big rain and runoff event. And what happens is, just like if you're trying to pour coffee out of a mug and it drips down the side and not where you're trying to pour it into, that's essentially what happens here. When we can build these structures effectively, water is coming into that half moon. It's working its way through the cracks. Some of it is infiltrating into the ground. And then when it comes to the bottom of that structure, it's going to, just like that water sort of coming straight out from your coffee mug, it's going to go out in these different angles so that it's spreading out across the hillside, which helps if again, you're trying to manage forceful concentrated flows. When building these, just like with that rock rundown structure, you want to take those big rocks that you can find, create a small trench and fit them snugly into the land so that they're just an inch or 2 above the soil. and that's sort of your bottom downhill row of rocks. And then from there, you can build it up so that, again, it's large enough to capture rain that you would typically find racing down your particular hillside. Any questions about media lunas?
Daniel, is it a half circle or a third of a circle, or what's the best way to describe the geometry of that?
I would say it's, it really depends on those topographic maps, or
Okay.
the topographic lines. But yeah, we'll call it a half circle. Again, you want it to be, whether it's a third of a circle or a half of a circle, in part depends on how much runoff you're needing to capture. If you've got a tremendous amount of water coming off, you might want it to be more like, it's going to probably be wider and deeper. But if you only have, we'll say, a casual amount of runoff coming off, then the structure perhaps doesn't need to be as wide, as deep, and as more towards a half circle. So it really depends on the site and how much water you're trying to manage.
So not to add too much length to your discussion here, but what's the history of that?
Of media lunas?
Yeah. I mean, is this, I've never seen one, or at least never seen one and known that it was called that. Is this a...
So a lot of these structures, I'm sure that there are precursors that I don't know, but a lot of these structures have been popularized by a restoration expert named Bill Zeedyke. He has worked with organizations across the Intermountain West, in New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado and Utah. They've been doing this stuff for decades. This is old news to a lot of folks out west, but for us in the hill country, this is still weird and new and foreign. And so it's exciting for me to get to share these practices in the hill country and to get those weird looks. And they're not easy. They're not simple. It takes thinking about them and reading about them several times and frankly, I'm still gaining confidence in how you actually build and design these. But my hope tonight is just to expose you to some new methods, and I'll share with y'all after the presentation several resources that Hill Country Alliance has developed to further your knowledge of how these structures function and some of the key considerations for how to build them on your own property. So, does that answer your question, Patrick?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. So now we're going to get to the one that I find to be the most complex, and that's the Zuni Bowl. How many folks have seen a culvert like this one where water just comes firing out like a rocket? Anybody ever seen a culvert designed like this one? I see some thumbs up. Yeah, it's a pretty common occurrence. And so just look at, on the uphill side of that walking trail, look at the elevation versus on the near side, the downhill side of that walking trail. That's several feet of erosion that's happened, where water that is firing out of that culvert has just kicked away a tremendous amount of soil and formed a really serious gully there. And so we talked, back to Jerry's question, we talked about one structure that you can use in this situation, and that's the rock rundown. And this is the second one. This is called a Zuni bowl. And the idea here, again, is to stabilize those head cuts so the water doesn't just keep eating away at your hillside. So let's look at a Zuni bowl. Let's talk about what they look like, what they are, how they function. So here's that same site. You see the walking trail. You can see the culvert. They actually plugged in the culvert on the uphill side so that water would no longer be concentrated through that pipe and fired down into that gully. But instead they used rock, and they also modified the slope of the soil a little bit so that they are slowing and sinking that water using this method called a Zuni bowl, complemented with another structure called a one rock dam, which is pretty intuitive. The one rock dam on the left, you can see it where the person in the black t-shirt is building it. It is literally a row of rocks. It's only one rock tall. It's not multiple levels, just one level of rocks stacked snugly together, and importantly, across the whole width of that channel. Why do you think that would be important, to make sure that the one rock dam is spanning the whole width of the channel? What would happen if you did not do a good job of building that row of rocks across the whole width of the gully? What would happen if you did not do that?
Water would undercut it.
Yeah, water would just undercut or pinball around that structure and just, you know, carve out a big chunk of the bank of that gully. So yeah, how we're creating these structures, you know, whether you like puzzles or you like art, you know, it takes some care and consideration to find the right rocks and fit them well together and meld them well into the landform. So yeah, with these one rock dams, you want to make sure they're going across the full width of that gully so the water is not just racing around them. I'm going to zoom in now on the Zuni bowl itself. So there's a few features to the Zuni bowl. With this particular site, the banks of that gully were really, really steep. And so just like with that rock rundown, we decided to move just a little bit of soil so that we had a gentler slope. It could form a nice bowl. We also did broadcast a bit of seed underneath the rocks. And what you do, just like with the rock rundown, you start at the bottom, you get those big rocks, you create a small trench with a shovel, and you nestle those rocks into the soil so that they're only about an inch or two above the ground. We call that our splash apron, so that water, as it's ultimately filling that bowl and coming over, it's not just hitting bare rock and causing erosion, but it's hitting that rock, which is going to absorb some of the energy. So we start again at the bottom. We take those big rocks and we nestle them into the soil. We call that our splash apron. We then build what we call our lower pour over of the bowl, so that if we have enough water that's actually filling that bowl, it's ultimately going to have to pour over that lip, and it's going to land on that splash apron. And then it's going to go down the gully and get slowed by that first one rock dam. If it gets past that one, it's going to encounter another one rock dam. So again, these structures are reinforcing one another. Above the lower pour over, or that lip of the bowl, you then have the bowl itself, or the plunge pool, and you can't quite see to the bottom of it. But again, each of these rocks is fit well with one another and with the soil, so that you really have a nice cohesive bowl structure catching water that's coming down that hillside. And then you have the upper pour over, where this is a little unique because you have the walking trail there, but ideally the top of that rock structure is going to be nestled in well with the surface of the hillside, so that the water is going to run into that bowl and not get diverted to the left or the right. And each time it's coming down those rocks, it's being slowed down. Some of it's going to be working its way through those cracks and infiltrating. And we're taking away the force and the velocity of that water, again, so that we're improving the moisture around this whole area for those plants. We're recharging the aquifer. And yeah, we're stabilizing that head cut. I'm going to show examples of other Zuni bowls, or structures that perhaps are similar to Zuni bowls. This is a landowner who had a lot of runoff coming down the hill in their driveway. On the left, you can see that they took a shovel and made the slopes a little more gentle. Once they did that, they were able to create their bowl-like structure to capture that water. And then they created 2 one rock dams below the Zuni bowl You can see that the rocks go the full width of that channel. So that again, we're slowing and sinking water, we're trapping sediment, and we're stabilizing our head cuts. With that, I'm going to do a quick recap of the advanced strategies, because again, I recognize that, Patrick, as you said, these aren't terms that we throw around in the hill country a lot. These are strategies that are pretty new for Texas and especially for the hill country. So again, we talked about the rock rundown structures, which are designed to stabilize head cuts. We talked about a second method to stabilize head cuts, the Zuni bowl. We talked about berms and swales that capture and store lots and lots of water. And then we also talked about media lunas, which are designed to take concentrated runoff and spread it out across a pasture or a hillside. And then before the advanced strategies, we talked about some of the more simple, lower risk strategies, such as using logs and rocks along the contour lines. And we also talked about using biomass, cedar slash, similar to mulch, again, to slow and sink water into the ground rather than racing down the hill. I have a couple of wrap-up slides, but before I get there, any questions about the strategies, whether it be the simple ones or the more advanced ones?
Excuse me. It looks like for the berms and swales, there was some kind of rubber tired equipment used to build those. And I guess it varies with terrain and everything else, what you've got to work with. You know, sometimes when I see berms and swales, I think of the terraces that were cut years ago, and you know, who knows what they used, probably mules at one time, obviously, to make those. But could you use a maintainer, you know, a road grader to make these gentle berms and swales if the topography allowed that?
I would say use what you've got. Again, once you start to move soil, that creates a little bit of risk because you're potentially destabilizing the site. If you're using heavy equipment, you're potentially compacting the soil. So there are some trade-offs, there are some risks when you start to move soil. So I would say somewhere between be resourceful and use what you've got, but also to the extent possible, find the right tool for the job. You know, if it's a small swale, you can definitely use hand tools. But in this case, yeah, they moved quite a bit of dirt to create these swales. These are very large features that we were looking at. All right, well, I'm going to bring it home. So again, we covered a lot of ground. We talked about soil health. We talked about erosion. We talked about a variety of strategies that we can employ on our hillsides to slow and sink water. There are a lot of great resources out there if you want to learn more about these topics. The Quivira Coalition, they're a nonprofit based out of New Mexico. They have some incredible resources available on their website, especially how to create some of these more advanced structures like Zuni bowls and media lunas. They also have a great resource on their website for how to design and improve those ranch roads so that they're not a source for erosion, but again, helping slow and capture that water. Great stuff there. The National Center for Appropriate Technology has a Soil for Water program. They have great resources, especially around soil health and those guiding principles. Check them out. If you want someone to come help you map out those contour lines on your property, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources Conservation Service, more than likely the local office has a laser level and could come out to your property and help you map out those contour lines. Earth Repair Corps, they're a nonprofit based in Blanco County who offers a lot of great training through permaculture, which offers really great insights for how to understand the land and work with waters that we're slowing and capturing it. if you want some resources to start to look at the topography and the contour of your own property, the U.S. Geologic Survey as well as the Texas Forest Service both provide free online mapping services that you can use to start to look at your property and perhaps understand it through this lens of topography and contour lines. And of course, the Hill Country Alliance, I have a couple of resources we call Hillside Stewardship Part 1 and Part 2 that I will send to Lynn and Jerry. I would love it if y'all would share that with the rest of the folks at the Native Plant Society, which again, just explain both the simple and advanced strategies. And if you have any questions today, tomorrow, next week, please be in touch. Don't be shy. Again, to step back, when we slow and sink water, y'all talked about these things already. There's a lot of remarkable benefits that come from that. We're able to build up our soil profile so that we can grow beautiful native plants for us to enjoy, for wildlife, for livestock. When we slow that water down, we're dissipating energy, so we're mitigating floods, we're trapping sediment. So if you have some bare ground or some caliche on your property, we can capture that sediment, build up enough soil to start to establish plants. We're storing water in the land, in the aquifer. And when we do that, we know that that's going to recharge that aquifer and it's going to reemerge somewhere through a spring that's going to feed our creeks and that Blanco River. So there's so many benefits that are reaped when we slow and sink water. And as we saw from that slide about 1 acre and 1% improved soil organic matter, helping to enhance catchment by 25,000 gallons. If we all start to do this stuff, it scales up to make huge differences. So again, my hope today was that you learned a thing or two, that you walk out on your property and look at things with a new eye tomorrow. And again, you think about, don't race out and buy a bunch of stuff or get the equipment out tomorrow, but start to think more about ways that you might slow and sink water on your own property. Again, I'll share those resources with Lynn and Jerry that go into some of the specifics for how you can do that. And with that, I'm going to stop. I have no idea if that was too much, not long enough, but if we have time for discussion, I'd love to hear from y'all about how you are slowing and sinking water in your property. If you've got some challenges or lessons learned you want to share or questions to pose, I want to create time for that. But again, if we've gone overboard and need to wrap up, that's fine too.
I think as long as people are willing to be a part of the discussion, let's go forward and have it.
Daniel, I have one question. Could we use Hill Country Alliance as a resource on our website?
That would be fantastic. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
If there are no questions, I'd love to hear from y'all. Have y'all had successes, failures for how you?
Question.
Yeah,
I
go
put
ahead.
a question in the chat, but I don't think it's. Do you see the chat?
If I stop sharing my screen, I think I'll be able to see it.
Yeah.
The question was, can you talk about how mowing is bad?
Wasn't my question, Alice.
I'm sorry. Yours is different. Yeah.
I have about 3 acres of native grasses, and I'm slightly worried about fire, not terribly, but slightly. And I just wondered if one should shred occasionally, and if so, do you recommend shredding or do you recommend leaving it alone? And they're little blue stem, and I counted about 15 different native grasses this year.
I, Sarah, am not the best person to answer that question, to be honest with you. I mean, I can give you a partial answer, but I think the better response would be to encourage you to look up you can go to Texas A&M Forest Service. Their website is phenomenal. They have so many resources for landowners, but through their website, you can also find your local forester, and they could come out and talk to you about, what are some of the wildfire risks associated with your property and how to mitigate those. Not having seen your place, it's hard for me to answer that. And frankly, mitigating wildfire is not my expertise. But in general, mowing, just like any other management activity, has its trade-offs. If you disturb a site too much, you can encourage some undesirable species coming in. If you're just going in and mowing in the winter time after that little blue stem has gone to seed, when and how much you mow is going to have different outcomes. And so it's a great question, but I'm afraid I don't have a good answer other than to encourage you to reach out to your Texas Forest Service, local forester. I'll also open it up. We've got some super smart folks here. Do y'all have thoughts for reducing fuel loads, especially or specifically with regard to grasses?
I certainly can't do a prescribed burn. My neighbors would have hysterics.
That was going to be my suggestion.
If you'll go to Firewise USA, they give some setback distances and stuff like that from structures for managing fuel loads and whatnot. That's a program that's available.
Well, thank you, Patrick.
Certainly. And I'm sure you're doing this. I mean, you want to mow it or shred it once every few years anyway to kind of invigorate its health.
Well, that's what I was trying to find out, because I've been here 3 years now, and this fall it was absolutely beautiful. I've even found a ladies' tresses orchid and things
awesome.
like that. So I was very excited. In fact, I found 3. And I have those beautiful, it's gone out of my head. I have a COVID brain. Those beautiful little blue flowers that come up
Solanaster?
in the spring.
Celestial.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I really love this property, and I want to do right by it. So I don't want to go rushing out there with I wouldn't mow it. I was thinking more of getting something to just shred it, sort of 9 inches high. But it is getting
sorry.
quite a lot of grass there.
My brain is finally kicking back in. I'm not accustomed to giving evening presentations, and so I'm getting my second wind. If you think back to the slide on soil health and the guiding principles, one of the principles was, to the extent possible, integrate animals. Think back to how bison used to come and go through Central Texas. I don't know your property. I've never been to it, but if you have good fences and you have a neighbor or know a rancher who you trust, that's a great option to integrate livestock into your operation, both to reduce the grasses, but also, again, when they're coming onto your property, that hoof action, their dung, their urine, that can all, when done appropriately, stimulate and enhance the soil health. So I should have said that. That should have been my first response to you. But again, I don't know your property. I don't know your fences. But
they're old like me.
On a piece of property that small, would goats work?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, if it's a ½ acre, you could get chickens. I mean, there's all different kinds of livestock you can use to stimulate soil health, for sure.
Well, I'd like to throw in a caution though. If those animals come from land which is not native, you're asking for a lot of work in the future, getting rid of the seeds they bring in. And
they have to diapers to start with then.
Well, except of course you want the manure on the land, but the manure can be a problem with seeds.
Yes, absolutely. There are definitely nuances and other considerations, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
Horses would be one you wouldn't want.
Daniel, I understand there are some urban techniques for reducing runoff where they actually make a cavity under sidewalks or parking lots and fill it with gravel and then put a cover on top of that that will allow the water to go through. Are any similar things being used on landowners' properties?
That I can't think of a great parallel. I know that in Wimberley, for instance, there's a center of stores that in the parking area have started to use pervious pavers. So I think some landowners are using structures like that, with your, where you might park your cars. You can make sure you're not creating totally impervious cover, but using materials that still allow for some infiltration. So yeah, I'm seeing that stuff. I mean, even just someone mentioned earlier in the presentation, having a dirt road versus a paved road. At least that dirt, though it's compacted, there can still be some infiltration versus once you pave that stuff, it's just going to race and run off. So I get it's all relative, but I have not heard of anyone on a private property doing the specific example that you provided.
Daniel, since you've worked some out west, and maybe you were more arid than where they're using some of this stuff, the beaver dam analogs, have you heard of those or had any experience with those?
Yes, beaver dam analogs, for folks who are not familiar with these. So to rewind, beavers historically provided such a tremendous role in terms of the ecology and slowing and storing and sinking water in the landscape for a variety of reasons, especially historical ones. We do not have the same level of beavers that we used to historically, and so we're not getting those same services. A beaver dam analog is a structure that humans can make that tries to replicate what beavers do. And so I'm oversimplifying it, but you essentially, assuming you can do this, you basically hammer stakes across the width of a channel, and then you can weave, say, willow branches in between those stakes, and then that structure is going to slow water down, trap organic matter, and start to do some of the same things. Is that a fair characteristic, Patrick?
Yeah, absolutely, you bet. My fear around here is that we're so prone to flash floods that you would do a lot of work and they might be gone in a week or a month or 3 months or.
Yeah, so I've definitely seen them used. They need to be used on smaller streams as opposed to the main stem of the Blanco. I know people in West Texas are starting to tinker with them. I don't know of any examples in the hill country.
Well, let's come out to my place sometime and let's make a couple.
Sounds good, Patrick. Well, with that, I want to thank everyone for being great participants, for all your questions. Again, here's my email address, daniel@hillcountryalliance.org. If you're not familiar with the Hill Country Alliance, you can check out our website. We have an awesome newsletter. It's free. It comes out about twice a month with all the conservation headlines throughout the Hill Country, as well as upcoming events, which at the moment are mostly online, but it's just a great resource for what's happening related to conservation throughout the Hill Country. So check us out, hillcountryalliance.org. And again, thanks for all that y'all do to improve the health of our native plants, and for a really nice night.
Thank you, Daniel. We
Great.
appreciate your time and your expertise and introducing us to these ideas. And I hope we do get a chance to do a little personal work using these techniques.